Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Canadian military culture and recruitment challenges.
Hmm.
And it seems to be a really hot topic right now.
Yeah, definitely.
We're going to be taking most of our cues today from this opinion piece we have from the Toronto Sun.
Right.
And it's quite a fiery one.
It is.
They are taking aim at what they call the woke culture, overtaking the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because they use conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's critique of the liberal government's approach as kind of a jumping off point.
Yeah.
Poilievre is promising a complete 180
Right.
if he's elected to return to a warrior culture, as he calls it.
Yeah, that's right. And the article definitely doesn't shy away from some pretty eyebrow-raising examples of what Poilievre and others see as problems
Sure.
with this whole situation. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'm curious about the historical context here.
Hmm.
Have we seen these kinds of culture wars within the Canadian military before?
Absolutely. I mean, the Canadian military, like many Western militaries,
Yeah.
has always kind of grappled with evolving social values.
Right.
I mean, think back to the debates about integrating women into combat roles or the acceptance of LGBTQ plus personnel.
Right.
Each of those shifts sparked very similar anxieties
Oh.
about eroding, warrior culture.
So this isn't like a totally new phenomenon then.
No, not at all.
But this article really hammers home this idea that the current government's emphasis on diversity and inclusion
Hmm.
is actually hindering their operational effectiveness.
Yeah,
They even go as far as to say that it's a major factor in this recruitment crisis.
right. And they use gender-based analysis plus or GBA plus
Right.
as their prime example.
Okay, so what is that? What is GBA plus? The article kind of throws that term around but doesn't really dive into the specifics.
Right. Well, GBA plus is essentially a framework for analyzing policies and programs to make sure they're inclusive
Okay.
and consider the needs of diverse groups.
Mm.
It looks beyond just gender, taking into account things like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic background.
Okay, so on the surface, that sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Making sure the military is a place where everyone feels welcome and respected.
Right.
But how did it become like such a lightning rod in this whole debate?
Well, the article argues that the implementation of GBA Plus has gone too far,
Okay.
that it's become more about political correctness than actual combat readiness.
Oh, okay.
They even bring up this example of Canada sending gender advisors to Ukraine.
Wow.
Well, Ukrainian soldiers are fighting for their lives.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark juxtaposition.
Yeah.
I can see how some people might see that as prioritizing social justice over combat effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't there an argument to be made that a modern military needs to be sensitive to these issues,
For sure.
especially when they're operating in these complex environments?
Absolutely. I mean, the world has changed,
Right,
and the nature of conflict has changed along with it.
right.
Modern warfare often involves peacekeeping, humanitarian aid,
Right.
and working with diverse populations.
Yeah.
Cultural awareness and sensitivity are arguably more important now than ever.
So it's not as simple as just saying GBA plus is bad or good.
Right.
It's about finding that right balance,
Exactly.
which I imagine is no easy feat.
Well, it's not.
But the article uses this as fuel for their claim that this so-called woke culture is actually turning off potential recruits.
Yeah.
They even cite the Navy dropping their traditional anthem due to gendered language as further proof of this shift.
Right. And that really gets to the heart of their argument.
Yeah.
They're suggesting that the military is prioritizing optics and political correctness over tradition and core values.
But are they oversimplifying things a little bit?
Well,
I mean, military recruitment is a very complex thing.
it is.
There are other factors contributing to this shortage of over 16,000 personnel.
Really? Right. Economic conditions, public perception of military service,
Right.
the evolving nature of warfare itself.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things play a role.
Yeah.
It's a much bigger picture than the article portrays.
Yeah. It's interesting how they focus on all the potential negative impacts of this cultural shift.
Mm-hmm.
But are there any arguments in favor of a more diverse and inclusive military?
Oh, yeah.
Like, couldn't that actually be a strength in certain contexts?
Absolutely. I mean, studies have shown that diverse teams are often more creative,
Okay.
adaptable, and effective at problem solving.
Right.
And this could be particularly valuable in a military context.
Yeah.
where adaptability and innovative thinking are crucial.
Right. So maybe this isn't just about woke versus warrior,
Right.
but about finding a way to like integrate those values
Yeah.
to create a military that's both inclusive and effective.
Exactly. It's not about choosing one over the other.
Right.
It's about finding a way to bridge the divide.
Okay.
And that's where Poilievre's proposed solution comes in.
Okay.
This idea of returning to a warrior culture.
Okay, let's dive into that. What exactly does Poilievre mean by warrior culture?
Right.
And how does he envision this shift actually happening?
Well, the article kind of portrays it as this back to basics approach.
Okay.
Prioritizing combat readiness and national defense above all else.
Mm-hmm.
I think rigorous training, a focus on traditional military skills, and a very clear chain of command.
So it sounds like Poilievre is tapping into a certain nostalgia
Yeah.
for like a simpler time
Yeah.
when the military's role was more clearly defined.
Right.
But how does that square with the realities of modern warfare?
Yeah.
We're not just talking about like traditional battlefield combat anymore. I mean,
Right.
cyber warfare, drone strikes, these hybrid conflicts, these
Yeah.
all require very different skills and mindsets.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
Could a hyper-focus on this warrior culture, as the article defines it,
Mm-hmm.
actually make the military less adaptable to these evolving threats?
Right.
I mean, it's easy to romanticize the past.
Yeah.
But we need to be careful not to fall into that trap of thinking that what worked decades ago is automatically going to translate to success today.
Right. The article kind of glosses over that complexity a little bit,
Yeah.
instead opting to emphasize Poilievre's confidence that this approach will solve the recruitment crisis.
Mm-hmm.
They even quote him as saying, young people are craving that sense of purpose,
Right.
that clear mission of defending their nation.
Yeah, it's a powerful narrative,
Yeah.
but it assumes a certain homogeneity in what motivates people to enlist.
Mm-hmm.
While some might be drawn to that traditional warrior ideal,
Right.
others might be looking for opportunities to serve in different capacities.
Right.
Peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, disaster relief.
Right. And wouldn't that narrow focus on just combat readiness potentially alienate those individuals?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, if the perception is that the military has become less welcoming to diverse viewpoints,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't that just exacerbate the recruitment challenges?
Absolutely. And that raises a whole other set of questions about retention as well.
Right.
So let's say Poilievre's vision comes to fruition and this cultural shift takes place.
Mm-hmm.
Will that create an environment where individuals from all backgrounds feel valued and respected?
That's a really good point, because it's one thing to attract recruits,
Right.
but retaining them is a whole other battle.
Exactly.
And if people feel like their voices aren't being heard or their contributions aren't valued,
Mm-hmm.
they're more likely to leave.
Right. The article frames this whole debate as this binary
Yeah.
woke versus warrior.
Right.
But the reality is far more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
We need to be asking ourselves what kind of military culture will best serve Canada in the 21st century.
Right.
And that requires a deeper understanding of the motivations of those who choose to serve
Mm-hmm.
and a willingness to kind of embrace the complexity of it all.
Yeah. The article almost seemed to imply that this woke culture is a uniquely Canadian phenomenon. But haven't other Western militaries faced similar challenges
Oh, absolutely.
with integrating diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, for example, the U.S. military has grappled with very similar issues.
Right.
The integration of women into combat roles, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Mm-hmm.
Those were all highly contentious debates
Right.
that raised similar anxieties about eroding traditional military culture.
So this struggle to reconcile changing social values with the demands of military effectiveness
Right.
isn't unique to Canada.
No, it's not.
It's something that many nations are facing,
Mhm.
each with their own specific context and challenges.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to approach this issue with nuance and a global perspective.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot we can learn from how other countries have navigated similar challenges.
It seems like this whole debate really hinges on this question of what the primary function of a modern military should be.
Yeah.
Is it solely about combat readiness and national defense? Or does it also encompass other roles, like peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, promoting stability?
And as are mutually exclusive, are they?
Right.
A military can be both combat ready and culturally sensitive.
Yeah.
It could be a force for both defense and diplomacy.
The article doesn't offer much in the way of solutions, aside from this vague notion of returning to a warrior culture.
Right.
But what would a more balanced approach actually look like?
Right.
How do we reconcile the need for a strong and effective military with these demands of social progress and inclusion?
Yeah, that's the challenge facing policymakers and military leaders today.
Right.
And there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
It requires a commitment to open dialogue, a willingness to listen to diverse perspectives, and a recognition that a one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to succeed.
This has been quite a deep dive already.
It has.
We've gone from gender advisors in Ukraine to the very essence of what it means to be a soldier in the 21st century.
Right.
And it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, you're right. This conversation could easily continue for another hour.
Yeah.
And we still wouldn't have covered all the angles.
So as we wrap things up, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listener to consider?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that this debate about woke culture versus warrior culture is way too simplistic.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is far more nuanced,
Mm-hmm.
and the solutions are likely to be pretty complex as well.
It does feel like the article was really trying to, push this complicated issue
Yeah.
into this neat little box.
Yeah.
And it's anything but neat.
Exactly. And also, I think it's important to remember that the Canadian military,
Right.
like any institution, is really just a reflection of the society that it serves.
Yeah.
So as society evolves,
Right.
so too will the military.
Right.
And the challenge is finding ways to manage that evolution effectively,
Right.
without compromising those core values of duty, honor, and service.
The article makes it sound like the military exists in a vacuum, separate from all the social and political currents that are shaping the country.
Right.
But it's clearly not that simple.
No, not at all. And I think that's a key takeaway for our listener, too.
Mm-hmm.
When you come across these kinds of debates about the military,
Right.
try to view them through a wider lens.
Yeah.
Consider the historical context, the social and political forces at play, and, the diverse range of perspectives.
Yeah, it's not about choosing sides in a culture war.
Right.
It's about finding ways to bridge the divide,
Exactly.
to create a military that's both effective and reflective of the values of, modern Canada.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that requires, open and honest dialogue,
Yeah.
a willingness to challenge our own assumptions,
Yeah.
and a recognition that there's no easy answers here.
Yeah, I remember at the beginning of this deep dive, I was wondering, are these kinds of culture wars within the military, are they a new phenomenon?
Yeah.
And it turns out they're not.
Not at all. I mean, the Canadian military has gone through similar periods of introspection and adjustment throughout history.
Right.
And each time it's emerged stronger and more adaptable.
That's actually pretty reassuring.
Yeah.
It suggests that the institution does have a capacity for change,
Right.
for evolving with the times.
Absolutely. And that's an important message, I think, for our listeners.
Yeah.
The Canadian military isn't this static entity that's frozen in time.
Right.
It's a dynamic force, constantly adapting to new challenges
Right.
and evolving social norms.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
I came in thinking it was just going to be about woke versus warrior.
Right.
But it's so much bigger than that.
It always is.
Yeah.
These kinds of debates often serve as a window into, much larger questions
Yeah.
about national identity, the role of institutions in society,
Right.
and the values that we prioritize as a nation.
And those are definitely questions worth pondering,
Yeah.
regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum.
It's exactly. At the end of the day, the future of the Canadian military is something that should concern all Canadians, not just those who serve in its ranks.
Well said. This has been a really fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive
Yeah.
into a topic that's clearly generating a lot of heat right now.
Yeah, a lot of strong opinions out there.
So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.